So this inequality is based, for example, on the complex and unfair terms and conditions within the contracts. In many cases, the contracts are complex. It is not easy to understand from the farmers to understand. Me as a lawyer as well, I would say that they are really, really complex for lawyers as well. So imagine for farmers, so there is a need to have these contracts simpler in a plain language for them. The issue, as I mentioned earlier, of farmers' rights to know their rights, the right to opt in or opt out of a contract, to give consent. It is important as well. There is also the lack of benefit sharing between farmers and agribusinesses. In many cases, farmers are unaware of the value of benefit sharing, hence they are reluctant to give their data to whether it is researchers or to the Minister of Agriculture, for example, because they don't really get back the benefits of the data once processed. And that leads, of course, in many, many cases to data asymmetries, monopolies, to power and knowledge imbalances between the stakeholders, because as we said earlier, there is a limited access of some farmers to these digital technologies or to the data that they generate, and that leads to the well-known digital divide. And of course, there is the risk of misuse of farmers' data. There is also the issue of data literacy. As I mentioned earlier, in many, many cases, farmers don't have the knowledge of using these technologies, the applications. Of course, there are trainings in many cases, but in developing countries, usually they receive this information via SMS or radio. Next slide, please. So the question is, of course, how should farmers' data rights be implemented and protected? How do we really put farmer in the center of these discussions? And there is a need for a cultural shift, that's for sure. And of course, many policies need to be put in place or revised in national, regional, and international level, exactly to support farmers' rights to data information and knowledge. It is also important to increase awareness of smallholder farmers of their positions in agri-food networks as data originators and the value that they could extract from transactions exchanged based on their position. Education and empowerment of farmers via trainings, workshops, webinars, and farm hubs is also essential. And it is important to include farmers' representatives, farmers' associations in the development of farm data standards and in decision-making about data and information. And of course, there is the need for ethical frameworks such as codes of conduct. And the need here is because worldwide, there are not so many laws and regulation regarding agricultural sector. There is legislation more and more around privacy laws, but not specifically these issues are handled within the agricultural sector. So codes of conduct is a very good first step in doing so. Next slide, please. And why these codes of conduct is important. First of all, worldwide in the agricultural sector, we have already some examples with these principles and guidelines for fairer data governance. And it is the American Farm Bureau Federation's Privacy and Security Principles for Farm Data, the EU Code of Conduct on Agricultural Data Sharing by Contractual Agreement, the New Zealand Farm Data Code of Practice, and quite recently, the Australian Farm Data Code. These codes of conduct, I need to mention that they are not legally binding, they are self-regulatory, but what they do is to raise awareness around informed consent. They ensure participation and inclusiveness within the various stakeholders between agribusinesses and farmers organizations or farmers themselves. They deal with issues around disclosure, trust, and transparency. They cover normative gaps. And of course, they simplify the assessment of agribusiness behaviors. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, trust is built more when you have these codes of conduct, because first of all, they bridge, I would say, somehow the normative gaps. It is industry-led self-regulation in the form of codes of conduct, as mentioned, or voluntary guidelines. And they set common standards for farm data sharing contracts, even across countries and regions. And also, the companies that they are processing data with codes of conduct is a good way to demonstrate compliance with social responsibility requirements. And for that reason, they have developed, it has been developed some accreditation and certification schemes. The aforementioned codes of conduct, the agricultural codes of conduct that I mentioned to you, have already a certification scheme, except, the EU Code of Conduct that has only a checklist. All the other codes of conduct have developed a certification scheme where companies need to submit their policies, their contracts to independent authority in order to get certification and accreditation from independent authority. And as mentioned, these codes can really change the way agribusiness think about data and make data producers and, of course, primarily farmers more aware of their rights because they're more engaged into this dialogue when they are negotiating the terms and conditions within a contract. So next slide, please. Of course, codes of conduct are not perfect. There are some challenges that we have that they might possibly overlap or even conflict with existing legislation, such as consumer law and especially in cross-national flows. So another challenge and another question to be addressed within the situation of codes of conduct is who is the best position really to design, implement, and administer the data code of conduct? Do we have adequate adoption and enforcement? So what about legitimacy? Do we have sufficient representativeness? Do we have independent administration and auditing? Also, what about credibility? And there is also a risk of watering down the principles, meaning how really can we balance the interests and needs of different stakeholders in order to attract members to increase adoption, because we have different stakeholders with different needs and different interests. So we need to be cautious how we are going to deal these issues within the code of conduct. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, of course, these codes could be really effective, could really increase credibility. We could have exactly representation and inclusiveness between the various stakeholders. We could also take into account a farmer's perspective when they negotiate the terms and conditions to know more about their rights. We can really understand the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders. So it is a very good first approach on how to have a better, as I mentioned, a data governance framework, I would say. Next slide, please. So a good example of the codes of conduct in the agricultural sector is the toolkit of Gordon CTAG FAR that they developed and launched last year. And it is based on the work that had been done with consultations with various stakeholders. with reviewing the existing codes of conduct that I mentioned to you, seeing where are the commonalities, the differences, and what recommendations could we do to have a better code of conduct and more customizable, and mostly from farmers' perspective. So this tool features exactly 17 clauses from which the users should be able to select if they think that they are relevant, and proceed to a checkout where the selected clauses can be used as an output to a document. And what these 17 clauses really include. Next slide, please. It is about definitions, types of data that we've mentioned, who is considered the data originator, for example, who has the ability to control and access. It's dealing with ownership issues, consent as an important prerequisite for the codes of conduct, the purpose limitation, notice, meaning that when data is collected from farmers, they should be aware for what purpose the data is being collected. There is also the right to the data originator, as I mentioned, right to access to information, to data portability, contract termination, unlawful or anti-competitive activities, data protection safeguards, certification schemes. All these clauses, I need to mention, they're not exhaustive, and there are no substitute for a robust institutional framework to guide and operationalize decision-making concerning privacy and ethics. But still, as I mentioned, it is a very good tool because exactly it sets out principles and guidelines for fair and responsible data sharing. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in joining to the efforts of the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition initiative, which advocates of open data in agriculture, please join the Data Rights and Responsible Data Working Group, where it deals with the issues that we've mentioned or tried to cover with this presentation. And of course, the subgroup on codes of conduct, where it is a work in process. The next step, for example, with this tool is to use Uganda Farmers Organization as a pilot case to see how they really these codes of conduct could work in practice, and see where maybe are the gaps to evolve better this tool. So thank you. That was my presentation, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much for walking us through these guidelines. That was really insightful. I would like to open it up for questions and see if anybody has something they would like to discuss. I will get us started here with a question, and maybe others want to join in as they have questions. Foteini, you said that it's sometimes not clear what of farming data is personal and what is not. Could you elaborate a little bit on this point?
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned to you, for example, with location data from data that we can receive from satellites or drones, initially it's not considered personal data, but once you can, how can I say it, map them and relate them to a location of a farmer, then this person can be identified. So there is an issue around privacy, around his identity. So sometimes, yes, it's not so clear to understand where you have personal data or there is non-personal data. As I said, soil data, weather data, it is considered non-personal data. Yes, of course. But sometimes when you are collecting data, of course, you don't collect only data that is considered non-personal data, you collect also personal data, and then you need to do the relevant processes, anonymization, for example, or encryption, so there is no harm or no misuse of personal data. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there another question?
Yeah, and I think there's a question in the chat.
Oh yeah, Stephen Sekaleli is asking, should farmers' rights be included in IPR? If not, what may be the outcome? And maybe Stephen, do you want to elaborate a little bit? I don't even know what IPR is. Intellectual property rights, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, but what's exactly the question? Should farmers' rights be
included in intellectual property? Stephen, do you want to elaborate a little bit on your question?
Well, if I understood it clearly, right now, farm data, yes, there is no specific legislation around data ownership, and they are dealt mostly with copyright, patents, database rights, with IP rights. And mostly all these rights are dealt basically with contracts. So the first approach is exactly to consider them and have the perspective of consider them with IP rights. That's true, but it's not fully correct, because farm data is not a traditional type of property. And they don't really touch upon 100% on copyright or database right. But if we want to use any legislation, yes, that would be it. And as I mentioned earlier, basically they are dealt with within the contracts and the data sharing agreements, all these rights. And of course, about farmers' rights, there is the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, where their Article 9 refers to farmers' rights as well. But it needs to be further implemented, this international treaty concerning farmers' rights.
Stephen, did that answer your question? Any other questions that people have? I have questions, but I would like people.
I think there's an earlier question from Mohammed, actually before Stevens.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Nikos, since you just posted something, can we go to you first and then to the earlier question? Okay, I'll read out Nikos' question. What initiatives are needed to persuade small farmers share their data or curb their reluctancy, especially for regions with too many small farmers, like in the EU?
What initiatives? Well, that's a very good question. First, I would start by saying that, for example, the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition Initiative really advocates, and not only advocates, support and works towards that direction, how to include farmers into the discussions. And that has to do with developing policies and collaborating with governments, with NGOs, with academia. So it is one initiative. Other than that, of course, it has to do with the governments, their will to work on their policies and have open data policies. I will tell you an example. Right now in Kenya, the Ministry of Agriculture is exactly working on having a data governance framework concerning farmers' registration. So that's a very good first step. You see that they are interested in including farmers within discussion, and of course taking into account the privacy legislation. So there are also farm hubs. I could also mention, again, Kenya as an example. These farm hubs are centers where young farmers and women farmers go there, and they do trainings about data sharing, what's their rights, how to use applications to have benefits. So there are initiatives and work done also by the Food and the United Nations Food and Agriculture. There are initiatives. But of course, as I mentioned to my presentation, we need to have this cultural shift, meaning that we need more and more to include them. And one also way by doing that is via farmers organizations and cooperatives, I would say. These are my first thoughts. I don't know if I have covered you, Nico.
Yeah, hello.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Muhammad Faizan had a question asking, reinforcing the codes are the largest bottlenecks. What are the paths to reinforce the transparency through a farming community? And I guess if I may piggyback on that question, it seems like the codes of conduct are basically a self-governance instrument, right? So who would enforce them?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a very good question. As I mentioned during my presentation, that's an issue because the basic question is that who is going to do it? Is it going to be the agribusinesses, who have more power? Is it going to be NGOs, researchers? One suggestion, and it's not only a suggestion, but is this having an independent authority where would be able to audit these processes. For example, the USA principles around privacy, they have established an independent authority. There is the law firm of Tond Johnson, who is a lawyer and who really does these audits and accreditation. Every company that wants to be compliant has to submit, as I mentioned, their contracts, their policies to this independent authority. They're going to be evaluated based on initially 10 questions, and now I think there are 15. They have been updated. And if they are found that they are compliant to these principles, then they get a seal from the Ag Data Transparent Evaluator, and they can post it to their websites. And then, for example, farmers could have more trust about their transparency processes, about their disclosure. So already there are this system, if I can say it, but I need also to mention that not so many companies have submitted their policies and contracts. There might be around 20, 25. Among them is John Deere. So it's a good starting point. Same here applies with the Australian Farm Code of Conduct, the New Zealand Farm Code of Conduct. There is audits. They also need to submit their policies. They get a seal also. So for me, the answer, yes, is having independent authorities where they can audit these processes. And of course, governments could also develop these codes of conduct and have this also independent authority. It can be, it is a recommendation and a suggestion. But we are in initial point. We need to, yes, to have more adoption with these codes of conduct. But the good thing is that more and more are in this open discussion, whether they're farmers organizations, they're aware of their rights, about the processes, which are the principles. with these clauses, for example, and these features, they know now when to opt out, when to withdraw their consent or to give their consent. There are issues that more and more farmers specifically are aware. And hence the importance of farmers' organizations to really support the farmers through these processes and negotiate the terms and conditions within the contracts.
Thank you. And Mohammed had a follow-up question asking, is there a case where farmers have been able to successfully transact their data? I have seen efforts from the private sector, but with mixed results.
Sorry, but could you repeat the first part?
Yes. Is there a case where farmers have been able to successfully transact their data? I have seen efforts from the private sector, but with mixed results.
What could Stephen elaborate it more?
Mohammed, do you want to speak
Mohammed,
up?
Sorry.
Could you speak up and say a little bit more about your question?
About sharing their data and the benefits that they might have back. Is that the question?
I don't know. Let me see if he said data transaction.
Okay. Well, of course, as I mentioned in my presentation, and if I understood correctly the question, of course, there are benefits for farmers within the digital farming. I mean, through the applications, they have increased their income. They know, for example, they have an estimation about the prices of some products, or they have access, as I mentioned, for the prices, so they can have loans from the banks. There are benefits. And it has to do basically with the farmers that they have access to these technologies, and not only farmers have access to these technologies, so they can gain these benefits. But of course, digital farming with these technologies have improved their lives. Even with, for example, when they get information with SMS or via radio, still they get the benefits back, but not in a big, how can I say it, in a big scale. That's the thing. And in many cases, data is being collected, and then maybe the private sector, or yes, agribusinesses, for example, they get the value from it and don't return sometimes the value back to farmers. But I don't want to be pessimistic. I have seen exactly that. As I mentioned to you, there is the e-voucher, for example, in Kenya. There is an application where it really helps farmers to get information about prices or about fertilizers, so they could arrange their everyday life in the fields better and have a better input. So yes, we have seen these examples, these best practices, if you ask me, but we have quite a long way ahead of us.
Sorry to cut you off. Can I ask? This is, I don't know why my name is showing as Mohammed. This is Tiago. We actually spoke before. I think the question that I have is this, right? I mean, as we evolve and clients actually understand the value of the data that they generate, have you seen data transaction? Meaning, have you seen clients actually leveraging that either as an individual or as a community, leveraging that data that they produce in order to have leverage in negotiation with partners, with suppliers, and being able to actually transact that data in the market, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, all this digital effort must have a value for them at the end of the rainbow, right?
Yes.
So the value is digital transparency, meaning visibility and accessibility and transparency. I get that, but for them is actually, you know, they also want to understand that, you know, for a medium to large farmer, the value of their operation can be significant for somebody that is trying to scope out some information for a particular region or sub-region. that those particular farmer might be relevant or that community might be relevant, right? So have you seen that I've seen like an independent exchange here in US. It's called Farmobile. They've been acquired, unfortunately. So they were actually doing that. They were creating like an independent data exchange. This is from the private sector. I'm just eager to understand if you've seen similar kind of process happening at government level.
Well, as I mentioned to you, for example, in Kenya, within the Ministry of Agriculture, they have developed this e-voucher application where they get inputs and information around the prices. And for example, for coffee. And yes, I know that they have received the value back from based on the information that they get from the ministry. Other than that, right now, no, I'm not able to have another example, but in Kenya, they're doing a really good work. They have developed various applications, and via the trainings that they are doing to the farmers, via the farm hubs, they receive better information, and as I mentioned, they have increased their income from the governmental perspective. I don't know if I covered your question though.
Nikos had another opinion. I'll read it out. In your opinion, which region of the world is the most mature in terms of data governance related to agriculture? Are there any studies for the level of farmers' participation in data sharing and exploitation?
That's a very, very good question. I don't have a specific example about a country, to be honest, in the agricultural sector. If you ask me about the best, let's say, in terms of digitalization and all these issues around data governance, I would say Estonia in general. So I would imagine within the agricultural sector would be better. They have the best system and well known within digitalization. I don't have another specific example because the challenges in digital agriculture are all over the world pretty much the same. The most difficult country, difficult, it's not the correct word. The challenges are more in developing countries. Let's say another good example that I would give for best practices, that would be Australia. Australia, yes, has worked a lot in the agricultural sector. They have developed policies. They have this farm data code. They have a data strategy. So I would say Australia is quite way ahead. Also Estonia, as I mentioned, but then the issues and challenges are more in developing countries, in Africa or in Latin America. The issues lie there more.
Thank you. And Steve had a comment saying Open Team is doing work on farmers' data custody and value, and he shared a link here.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, wonderful. Any other questions we have? Okay. And he shared another link.
Oh yeah, I've seen it, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We have another meeting early December. I'm not sure, Joe or Matt, do you want to add some information?
I think
so that'll be the first Friday in December at noon Central Time, and that'll be our year in review. So it's kind of the one we do every year. We look back at the year in data science, and we look ahead to what's coming in 2022.
Thank you so much. So join us Friday, December 3rd, 12 to 1 p.m. Central Time. Sign up over on the Data Science User Group Urbana-Champaign meetup page, and we'll have a fun little get-together as we do at the end of the year. All right. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.